Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Spiritual Wanderlust podcast. I am Kelly Deutsch, and today I am joined by a very special guest who is one of the most popular spiritual writers today, Father Ronald Rolheiser. Father Ron is a professor, a retreat leader, an award-winning author, and serves as the president of the Oblate School of Theology. One reason why his writings are so popular is that he's able to speak in a very human language, which I deeply appreciate. I find one of the greatest marks of wisdom is to be able to speak deep truths very plainly, which Father Ron excels at. His books include The Holy Longing, Guidelines for Christian Spirituality, The Restless Heart, Finding Our Spiritual Home in Times of Loneliness, Sacred Fire, A Vision for Deeper Human and Christian Maturity, and many more. Today, Father Ron and I are going to be deep diving into mysticism, including longing, divine union, suffering, and lots of other exciting topics. So, Father Ron, I'm very excited to have you with us.
Good to be here. Thanks, Kelly.
Yes, absolutely. I wanted to start today just by asking, you've been talking about these topics of spirituality and mysticism for over 40 years. How did you first encounter the mystical path? Was it through the writings of mystics? Was it your own experience, something else?
Well, you know what? It's interesting, Kelly. That's right. 40 years. I'm old, so I was in my 30s before I got interested in mysticism. You know, as a seminarian, and in my initial field of theology, I wasn't interested in it. I somehow identified with something more exotic, you know, and whenever I tried to read a mystic like John of the Cross, I couldn't read him. And at one stage, I was teaching a course in Edmonton on religious experience, and ironically ran into a Methodist writer, Langdon Gilkey, was talking about how our society is undergoing a collective dark night of the soul. I thought, I want to find out what that is. And so then I started seriously getting into John of the Cross as the first mystic. And from there on, it's been a love affair. You know, then I kind of did them one by one. I did John of the Cross, got into the Teresas and some of the others, and contemporary mystics and so on. But it's just a wealth. It's a gold mine of religious wealth that really has been left unexplored, even in Catholic circles. It's making a comeback now. But when I was at the seminary in theology, we didn't study the mystics. You might study them at formation houses, and Protestant seminaries didn't study them at all, you know? And all of a sudden realized there's this deep well of incredible wisdom and so on. And since then, like people like John of the Cross have become the most deeply influential in my spirituality and theology.
Yeah, he's quite the one to start with.
Well, I was very lucky. I got a 6-week major research course by Michael Buckley at the University of San Francisco. And I went there in summer of 76. And he just led us through John of the Cross line by line. It's the greatest course I've ever taken in my life, you know. So.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds incredible. Because I remember when I was like 16 thinking mystics are important. I'm not quite sure like what it is about them. And I tried picking up, Teresa of Avila's Interior Castle, and I was reading it as, this 16-year-old who's getting excited about my faith. But, I was like, I'm pretty sure I'm missing some things here. Yeah. But it is really interesting.
That wouldn't be the place to start. Honestly, if somebody's there, start with Teresa of Lisieux, start with the other Teresa. And she's kind of the Anne Frank of the spiritual life. You can read her, but Teresa, John, you almost need to take a course on those people, you know.
Yes, I know. We're going to have to offer one of those later because they are so rich and deep. But I think, now that I've studied theology and have done things, it makes a lot more sense, like their worldview, their terminology. But at the beginning, you're just like, there's a lot happening here. I don't even know. For those who are listening who aren't familiar with mysticism, especially Christian mysticism, how would you define it?
Okay, and I may be a Confederate voice here, See, there's two, and I'm going to define it the way, later on in September, I'm going to give a talk on Ruth Burrows. And Ruth Burrows, I'm using her, and she's also supported by the great spiritual writer at the time, Bernie McGinn. See, a lot of people consider mysticism something extraordinary, an extraordinary experience where you have a vision, just some kind of extraordinary ecstatic experience. And mysticism can be that. There are mystics, Julian of Norwich and famous mystics. But by and large, mysticism, everybody can experience mysticism. So Ruth Burrows would simply say mysticism is when you touch a moment of clarity inside of yourself, where there's just no filters, like, let me give you an example. She was 18 years old. I'm going to use that in the talk. So, and she was a high school girl in England, and a bit feather-headed by her own. She wasn't very serious religiously, and they were on a retreat for graduation. And she and this other girl were fooling around, and the sisters pulled them out, and they said, "No, when we're in conference, you have to be in chapel." And so she'd have to sit in chapel for hours with the sister chaperoning her. And first, they were passing notes and humoring. But she said at a certain moment, she said, at a moment of clarity, not just, I knew who I was, I knew who God was, it's just a moment of absolute clarity, and changed her life. So Burrows, and that's my definition, it's being touched for real in a way that's deeper than words, deeper than thought, deeper than where at a certain point, you just know something, And see, we all have mystical experience. We aren't all mystics. Mystics can give articulation to it. But see, so there's two kinds. That there can be mystics of extraordinary experience. They have visions, they have ecstasies, they get the stigmata and so on. That's rare. There are people like that. But most mystics, they're human, they're ordinary. They have deep moments of clarity in which they just know.
Yes, I love that sense of unknowing. And I remember when I first heard of that book, Cloud of Unknowing, that made no sense to me whatsoever. But I feel like it has something to do with that sense of that you know, and you can't really necessarily put it into words, but there's something deep and anchored and rooted in that experience.
See, because usually we think we know, but we don't. Most of the time, we're thinking through filters and ideologies. If someone says to you, what do you really believe on anything? Sometimes you don't even know, you think, I always say, like, for instance, a couple of years ago when that movie came out, The Passion of the Christ, and there was so much for and against it. I said I was convinced that nobody ever watched the movie. We watched each other watch the movie. and then we react, because normally we're reacting to ideology, to everything, to our wounds and so on. But mysticism, it's a moment of clarity. You just know who you are, what reality is. That's a mystical moment. Yeah. See, then a mystically driven life is that you live out of that. See, then you don't live out of ideology. You don't live out of, false selves or ego, or you live out of, this is who I am.
Yeah. Talk to me a little more about that. What does that look like to live out of that sense of deep knowing or those moments of clarity? What does that look like?
Okay, let me risk it this way. I know we have three faculties, and that's been since today they say you have your head, your heart, and your gut. Okay, and people kind of know what the head is, and people kind of know what the heart is, but I don't think we even get what the gut is. Okay, okay, your head is your thought. Okay, your heart is your feelings, your affectivity, but notice they're not the deep part. You think with your head, you feel with your heart, but who's the you? Who's sitting behind there? See, and that's the gut. See, with your gut, your head tells you what you think is wise. Your heart tells you what you'd like to do. And your gut tells you what you have to do. I say it's your ought center, I have to do this. As opposed to, I want to do this. I think it's smart to do this. And see, and so with the great mystics, the Carmelite tradition, like John of the Cross, Teresa, it's what they don't say, what do you have to do? Don't ask yourself what you want to do. Don't ask yourself what you think is smart to do. Just, Kelly, what do you have to do? See, that's your gut. See, and that's your truer center, And it's not that your head and heart aren't important, but notice they aren't the deep part of you. You are thinking.
An external should either. It's not like I have to do this because somebody's telling me.
Really, from your deep side, see, and that's the voice of God. That's the voice of reality inside of you. Let me give you an example that I use. Peter, when Peter's before Jesus, right after Jesus has given the bread of life discourse in John, and he says, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you won't have life in me. And John said, they all walked away. They said, this is intolerable language. We can't hear this. And Jesus turns to Peter and said, "You want to walk away too?" And Peter said, "We'd like to." He said, "We have no other place to go." But then he says this, "But besides, we know that you have the words of eternal life." That's a very important text. At that moment, Peter's head isn't in it, his heart isn't in it, but a deeper part of him is in it. He's telling Jesus, "You sound like death, you feel like death, except we know this is truth." And see, that's a mystically driven life. Like for instance, in any marriage or any commitment, there's going to be times when your head isn't in it, your heart isn't in it. Mm-hmm. You can say, "I need to stay here. This is where truth is." See, that's mysticism. Mm-hmm. As Ruth Burrows defines it. So that you just know. See, when Peter's doing that, he's a mystic. Mm-hmm. He's saying everything says I should be out of here, except I know at a deep level this is going to bring me life.
Yes,
this is going to bring me life.
I feel like a lot of people today call that either like your body's wisdom or even intuition, like just that deeper sense that you know this is what you have to do. Yeah. And it's so helpful when you are discerning big decisions or, life changes or whatever, when something deep down, even if, whatever it might be, I could go over here and I could get paid less. And if I go over here, maybe I get paid more, but something in me, even though my head can recognize, the pros and cons of each, something in me is like, like.
Well, no, Kelly, you're right. See, your intuition is very close to that. Mm-hmm. See, the intuitive sense, notice the intuitive sense, it's not your head or your heart. Mm-hmm. That's another part of you. And that runs very close. You just have a sense. Mm-hmm. And that I need to do this. Are you familiar with the poet Rainer Maria Rilke?
Yes.
I remember his letters to the young poet. Mm-hmm. At one point, this guy asked him, "What should I do?" And Rilke, this could have been John of the Cross giving advice. He said, "Go into the stillest hour of your night and ask yourself, what do I have to do? Mm-hmm. What do I have to do here?" Mm-hmm. See, and it's not so much what society wants, your parents want, or whatever. It's just, to get to who is the true you, that's your gut, that's your soul, telling you, I need to do this. That's yes. Peter before Jesus saying, everything says you should walk away, except I know I need to stay here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, I know. And I love that. To me, that's a very easy way to explain Ignatian discernment, where it's like sink down into your gut or, if you want, into your body, wherever it is, and just feel whether or not that one decision feels more spacious and whole and, or do you feel like cramped and anxious and, like being able to sink down deep beneath the head that rationalizes like, but this would be, and what over here option B, and, or the heart. So yeah. That's...
Now, Kelly, can I use a colorful word?
Sure.
Okay. I can give you another example. Daniel Berrigan, the great maverick Jesuit. Mm-hmm. And I remember seeing this interview on television. I jumped out of my chair. I was a young priest. And so anyway, this interview says, Father says, where does your faith reside? Is your faith in your head or your heart? And Berrigan said, faith is rarely where your head is at. He said, it's even less rarely where your heart is at. He said, faith is where your ass is at. And he says, I'm not trying to be cute. He said, like, what are your commitments? Where are you sitting? He says, anybody in any commitment knows there's times your head isn't in it, your heart isn't in it. You stay in it. Why? Because you realize at a different level, I know it's a colorful word, but it kind of nails it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious too. So the podcast name is Spiritual Wanderlust, and I feel like that aligns very well with your book, Holy Longing. Yeah. And I'm curious how longings tie into all of this, and like, where do these longings come from, and what's their point? Why do we have this kind of existential restlessness and wanderlust?
Well, Kelly, that is not just the holy longing. That's the deep motif in all of my writings. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, the articulation comes from Augustine. Mm. I think one of the great lines, spiritual lines ever written, was Saint Augustine. He begins his confession with the lines, "You've made us for yourself, Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." Mm-hmm. So it basically, as Karl Rahner, who's incidentally, today we're celebrating the anniversary of the death of Karl Rahner, but he says, there is no finished symphony. Like in this part, we're always and that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. If you could be satisfied with something, you wouldn't have a soul in the human sense. See, we're infinity's inside of us. That comes from the image and likeness of God inside of us. So it keeps us perpetually dissatisfied, anxious, longing, yearning, and it's what drives us. So basically, it's the fire of God inside of us that draws us out, and it's the basis for all movement. It's interesting, in my writings, that isn't just in people; it's in everything. For instance, if you take the Greek word eros, which we've kind of reduced to sex and so on, but eros just means eroticism. But that's already in the atoms. Hydrogen and oxygen get married. Have a child called water. But at the protons, the neutrons, the whole world is yearning. So it's not just with people, where everything is incomplete, that's trying to complete and move out and move out and move out. It's the key to everything, so when God put us here, God made sure we weren't going to just settle on this planet. And again, since I've already used some color, I'll use some further color. I always say, I always told my anthropology students, I said, the difference between humans and animals? I said, cattle contentedly munch grass in pastures, and human beings discontentedly smoke grass in bars. And that's the difference. See, cattle haven't got this fire. Cattle don't have infinity inside of them, but we do. We do. And so kind of, you're never going to make full peace with this world. You can't, and that's also the best part of you. That's the part of you that's pushing you to greatness, to love, to universality, ultimately to heaven.
Yes, it's something that I love exploring, those tensions, and because it's something that's both beautiful and painful at the same time, like most things in life, it's like the greatest joys always have kind of a tinge of sorrow because it's not going to last forever, and the greatest sorrows sometimes have a tinge of joy because you have something to grieve. This means that you loved greatly. And it's painful though when you recognize that already but not yet. But I like how you express that, and I think that's one of the things that you see as that motif in the mystics, of they've tasted something of the divine and they just want more. And that's what drives a lot of us to seek the contemplative life or get curious about mysticism, because we've tasted something and it just lights that longing within us and we can't stop. Yeah. I'd like to talk a little bit about divine union, because divine union is something that mystics talk about. And for those of us on, kind of a contemplative journey, it's something that we might just call the aim of our longing is we want union, to be one with God, wrapped up with, ravished. There's all these wonderful images, especially in the mystics. But I think there's a common misconception about divine union that it means kind of like you were saying before, like these ecstasies or levitations or the heights of prayer. But a lot of the mystics and sages and saints talk about the cross as their marriage bed, of suffering as this place of intimacy. And so I was wondering if you talk a little bit about what divine union is and why would it include suffering?
Let's take the first part first. What divine union is. Actually, Kelly, that's more complex than we normally think. See, I think that the image we have of divine union is that precisely you have some kind of almost semi-ecstatic or ecstatic experience where suddenly you're at deep peace and all of a sudden all your longing is gone and you're just, you have a sense I'm one with God. That can happen, but John of the Cross would say that might happen late on in life and for a few seconds. If it happens, it'll be episodic. It's not, in this life and so on. But see, union with God is a complex thing, particularly for us as Christians. See, you notice the difference between us as Christians and theists. Like we're theists, but we're also Christians. But see, a Buddhist, a Hindu, a Muslim, a Taoist. See, for them, God is up just in heaven. For Christians, God is in heaven and on earth. We're the body of Christ, and so on. See, so for instance, for a Christian, if you're having a wonderful meal with your family and you feel that's union with God. That's union with Christ, See, so that for us, it's also incarnational. You might say, well, this is really nice. It's just our Thanksgiving meal. But, no, that's union with God. See, because as Christians, we have God in heaven and God down here. Remember, Paul says, we are the body of Christ on earth. He doesn't say we're like a body or replace Christ. We are. See, so for a Christian, when you have experience of human wholeness, of human intimacy of any kind, that's also union with God, And then the other part of that, which is really tricky, and I'm still working on this, as is everybody, where somehow you think God is out there and union with God is you somehow have to, but God is more inside of you than you're inside of you. Like God is part of your very subjectivity. So that, that union with God is that you make peace with something outside of yourself. It's also going to involve making peace with something inside of yourself. God is part of our very subjectivity, but now your second part, the cross, that's a good question. It's a difficult question, and usually it has to be sorted out. Let me start with this. So Jesus says, if you become my disciple, pick up your cross, there's going to be pain flowing into your life. And you can ask a legitimate question, why? Like why would, if you love Jesus, pain's going to flow into your life, In fact, I love a line from Daniel Berrigan. Daniel Berrigan says, before you get serious about Jesus, consider very carefully how good you're going to look on wood. Okay, I love that line, But why? Well, there's a big misunderstanding. Like we somewhat think that if you get close to God, God purifies you through suffering and so on. No, the suffering comes this way. The suffering comes, the closer you get to God and to union with God and so on, the more sensitive you're going to become as a human being. And the more sensitive you're going to become as a human being, the more you're going to let pain flow into your life. Now, you're also going to let deeper joys, you're going to let everything flow more into your life. See, the opposite of that, I have English friends, and they have this expression that say, this guy is as thick as a plank, Well, see, a plank feels nothing. See, a plank is totally insensitive. See, so as a human being, I can be thick as a plank, which means I'm not going to have a lot of suffering in my life. I can drive over a child and go home and have a beer and say the kid shouldn't have been there, See, but the closer you get to Christ, the more you're going to open yourself up and the more you're going to feel. You're going to feel the cross, the pain, and the less you're going to protect yourself, Incidentally, as an aside, that's what distinguishes the real Christianity from the gospel of prosperity. See, prosperity gospels, put on Jesus and you're going to get special breaks. The real thing, put on Jesus, it's going to sensitize you and you're going to feel both the deepest pains and joys of this planet, and you're going to be crucified sometimes. And you're also going to stop protecting yourself against pain, because normally we know our egos protect us. I'm not going to always be safe. I'm always going to be comfortable and so on. See, so that pain will flow into your life, Now, the image of the marriage bed, that's an important mystical image. And for them, many of them, like John of the Cross, they used that for their death. See, they always felt this lack of union with God, a lack of union. And they say, see, we have the not yet, but the already. So they fantasized your death. That's going to be your wedding night. See, that's going to be your night of complete consummation and so on. But there's another mystical image in that's drawn out, and that is that the marriage bed is also a powerful image for your true home. But truly, give you an example. When I was teaching, I used to do some extension courses from secular universities back home. And one year I was teaching this course, and a young woman in class was 30 years old, very existential background. And I had the students read a book, from Christopher de Vink, who's a New Jersey writer. And he wrote a wonderful book way back in the early 90s called, what is it called now? So, Only the Heart Knows Where to Find Them, Precious Memories. But anyway, just a series of essays on his life and him as a young man getting married, having kids, and and not romantic because he's a great writer, but warm. So anyway, this woman comes to hand in her essay and she says, Father, she says, this is the best book I've ever read. She said, she said, I grew up with no religious background. She said, no moral instruction. She said, and I have slept my way through 2 Canadian provinces. She said, but now I know what I want is what he has. She said, I want the marriage bed. I need my sex to take me home. She said, I need the marriage bed. See, she said, I need that to take me home. So that's also mystical imagery. The marriage bed where you're whole, and so the mystics use that for when you die, you're coming home. That's your real home. It's your ultimate marriage bed. And so they looked forward to their deaths. John of the Cross would pray for death, and not in a morbid sense. Kind of, this is good, but I'm waiting for something better.
Yeah, you can see how that longing is, that's kind of the epitome of that, of all of their imagery about, being ravished by the divine. And I also like to think of how, marriage is not just sex. Like there's so much more to marriage, and how, like, Teresa of Avila would say, holiness is just doing the will of God. Many of the saints and mystics would say that. And the will of God is whatever is in your life, and so you don't have to go out and seek suffering, beat yourself or fast, and whatever kinds of sacrifices you think you need to make. But really just saying yes to your life, whatever that is, the joys and the sorrows, like you said, be welcoming them and opening yourself to them. And they come in so much more deeply as you draw closer to that divine union.
In fact, I'm glad you said that thing, Kelly. Someone should never seek suffering. Never. That's always unhealthy. No, that's not Christian. You don't seek suffering. You don't protect yourself from it if you shouldn't. But you never seek it. If you seek it, that's morbid. That's wrong. We don't seek to suffer. John of the Cross says this too. In the mystics, they say, and they say God doesn't handle people on conveyor belts. In some people's lives, God doesn't give a lot of suffering. And and John of the Cross said, we know that's the freedom of God. And he said, when there isn't suffering, just be grateful and enjoy the season.
Yes, I know. It's kind of remarkable. I thought it was very balanced. That I was part of a religious community for a number of years in Rome, and there were different communities that would sleep on a bed with boards basically, or have fasts every Friday, or just a variety of penances and sacrifices and such. And the community I had been a part of was like, our penance is living a balanced life. There are too many people who sleep too much or sleep too little, eat too much, eat too little, exercise too. They're like, get balanced, and then maybe we could talk about if there's anything else that God's calling you to, but just live your life really well. There's enough sacrifice already built in. We don't need to.
Richard McBrien, the famous theologian of Notre Dame, he had this expression very much like Richard McBrien used to say, practice the asceticism of joy. I like that.
I like that.
He said, that's maybe the ultimate asceticism of all. The asceticism of trying to stay happy. And he said that's real asceticism.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't want to go into this too deeply, but I'm curious then what the role of asceticism is in the spiritual life, because you hear about it in so many spiritual writers, especially in the Christian path, like desert fathers and mothers and, various people along the way. So what is the role of asceticism or of sacrifice, or however you might define that?
Well, let me give you an example. In asceticism, life itself will give you the correct amount of asceticism. I'm going to talk about, proactive asceticism later. And that is, for instance, do you have children?
Myself, no.
Okay. But imagine a mother has a baby. She's going to have to practice a lot of asceticism in the next months, getting up at night and so on. And she does it not, for example, I'm going to deprive myself of sleep. No, she just responds, But in all of our lives, if we live our lives honestly, there's going to be plenty of asceticism. You don't have to pick it. So that's the basic asceticism of life. There's interesting. I'm sure your watchers or participants here, they know who Carlo Credo was. Carlo Credo, the famous Italian writer, and Carlo Credo shares this in one of his books. At one point he was a monk in the Sahara Desert for 24 years, and he lived out there by himself, and he prayed, and he learned the Bedouin language and translated the Bedouin into scriptures into Bedouin and so on. And he prayed all those really thousands of hours. He said he went home to Italy to visit his mother. He said, my mother raised 10 kids and sometimes didn't have, time to go to the bathroom, not alone to pray. He said, and I realized she was more unselfish and more contemplative than I was. He said, and it didn't mean there's something wrong with what I did in the desert. It meant there's something wonderfully right. All the asceticism she was forced to practice as a mother, so that,
Yes.
if any of us, whether you're a parent or whatever, if you give yourself over to your work with honesty and so on, there's going to be a lot of asceticism. Now, what about Lent and fasting and so on, like I would call proactive asceticism? Well, I always tell people, when you do that, get spiritual direction to make sure. So sometimes you can proactively put heat to your spiritual life. So, you might have a seat say, I think I'm getting too comfortable or too complacent or whatever, and so I need to lay a little heat on here. I need some desert time or whatever. See, so you might do things like that, and they might be very, specifically related. Somebody say, I got a weight problem. I really got to look at the food thing in my life, or I have a TV addiction, or I have an addiction to the internet or something. I need to look at that, but see, you do that for a specific reason, but those aren't the major transformative asceticisms of your life. The major transformative asceticism is built into your life, that if you give yourself over, they're going to take you.
Yes.
At a certain point, they're going to take every ounce of energy you have and so on, and it'll lead you to sanctity.
Yeah, I feel like that ties in nicely with just the life of virtue, which I feel like is something that we don't talk about enough, because in a lot of contemplative circles, we'll talk about this pairing of the contemplative and the active and how important those are to have together. But I think many of us just assume that the active life is like social activism, or social justice or something, which could be part of it. But I think when a lot of the saints and spiritual writers write about that, about the active life, it's more the life of virtue. It's not necessarily or only taking care of the poor and being anti-racist and all of those things, but it's also working on those things like, do I have a weight problem? Am I gossiping too much under the guise of like asking people to pray for my friend, or what are my faults that I'm regularly tripping up and falling into? And I'm curious, how does virtue help us on the way to divine union?
Okay, that's a pretty theoretical question. You got me back in a classroom.
Yes.
How does virtue, rephrase that for me again, phrase it for me.
How does virtue help us on the way to divine union, or what role does it play?
Well, I'm going to give you a simplistic answer. It would need to be teased out, Sure. Classical medieval philosopher says you have to, the head follows, the heart follows the head. So you have to think your way into something new. But more and more today, people say you can act your way into a new way of thinking. You can act your way into transformation. See, so what virtue can do for you by doing the right things. Eventually, you'll become the right kind of person. If I can, I hope that's not too simplistically phrased. As opposed to first you think, what's the right kind of person to become? Then you try to act yourself into it. See, this reverses it. It's probably more. The way I do spiritual exercise, sometimes act yourself into it. Like act yourself into a new way of thinking and a new way of being. Do the right things, even if at the time they're forced and so on, your heart isn't there. Eventually, you get there. As opposed to, first of all, you perfectly think out, what should I become? What exercise I do to transform myself? Sometimes just do the right thing. Just do virtuous acts, and eventually you'll become a virtuous person.
Yeah.
Act yourself into a new person.
Mm-hmm. And really just thinking of it as doing the right thing in any given circumstance. Not that I need to like sit down and have my program, kind of like, I think it was Benjamin Franklin who would sit down and he's like, here are my virtues and here's what I'm going to work on, each day. And he kind of plotted it out and had a chart and a whole graph and, like he was very methodical about it, which cool, good for him. But I think, like we've been saying all along, life will give you the right amount of asceticism. Life will give you opportunities to grow in virtue. So you don't necessarily need to sit and think like, how do I be more courageous, But to recognize that, oh, maybe I need to have the courage to have that really difficult conversation with somebody at work because they've been continually interrupting me every time we get into like a big meeting and I'm sick of it. And instead of stewing and resenting, maybe I just need to like point it out and say, hey, I don't know if you realize you're doing this, but every time I speak, I get interrupted and we need to figure out how to do this differently. A lot of us don't think of that as like, that's my path. That's where I need to grow in virtue. But I feel like those very simple things are the opportunities that life gives us. Yeah. One more question on the role of suffering. How, in the Christian understanding, do we turn suffering into a prayer? How would you explain that?
It's a very good question. And actually, that's not a hard question to answer because Paul gave us the answer. Remember St. Paul says, when I don't know how to pray, then the Holy Spirit in groans that are too deep for words prays through me. See, so that, for instance, when you're groaning and suffering and so on, that is a prayer. I hope your audience aren't going to be scandalized. Sometimes the difference between swearing and praying is there's no difference. I'm like, my God, why is this happening to me? And so on. That's a prayer. That's your body. That's your inside responding, So when St. Paul says, when I don't know how to pray, then the Holy Spirit in groans that are too deep for words, prays through me. So sometimes we just say, Jesus Christ, is that a swear word or is it a prayer?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, because I think frequently people feel guilty, like, oh, I shouldn't be angry at God or I shouldn't curse the heavens or something. But it's like, that's actually quite scriptural. Have you read the Psalms?
And see, sometimes your body, your soul, it's just reacting. When you groan, that you groan under pain, that's a prayer. That is prayer. Like you don't have to turn that into prayer. Don't say, well, like I was suffering and now I'm going to pray about it and so on. You can do that secondarily, as a secondary movement, but just the groaning itself, the groan, oh my God, why is this happening to me? And so on. That is a prayer, just keep repeating. When I don't know how to pray, the Holy Spirit in groans that are too deep for words, or sometimes they're not even any words. You're just down. You're just like, how can this all be happening to me? And so on. That is a prayer.
Yes, I love that. It
Because
reminds
remember,
me. Oh, go ahead.
Kelly, the oldest definition of prayer, and it's still one of the best ones ever, is that prayer is lifting mind and heart to God. So we're not just lifting praise and thanksgiving, you're also lifting pain and bitterness and anger and so on. It's every movement inside of us, every emotion, every reaction is an opening to prayer potentially.
Yes. And it doesn't have to use words. It's really just that gesture of lifting, of offering, of whatever that interior movement is. And sometimes when we're so verbal, we forget that counts, that is part of it.
So that, I know this is terrible. You say, we say Jesus' name sometimes in reverence and sometimes not in reverence, but you're still invoking God and Jesus,
Yeah, it reminds me of Therese of Lisieux's definition, a surge of the heart, like cry towards heaven. a lovely and simple definition of what that is. One other question that I have been wanting to ask is, well, maybe I'll put this in two parts. I want to know the holiest person you've ever met and what surprised you about them, whether that was early on in life or, something later. And then the second part of the question will be, who is someone who is deceased, who you find, either the holiest person or someone that really speaks to you, whether it's a mystic or a writer or something else. So alive and deceased.
You had sent me a list of questions I looked at, and that one really stumped me, but in a good way, because I thought it was, and so I thought I'm going to rephrase that. I'm going to, it might not say, because normally when we think of holiness, we think of like obviously the Mother Teresa's, the overt figures of holiness and so on. But I would ask myself the question this way: who would I want to be across the table from all eternity? Like, would it want to be Mother Teresa, or like who would I want to be sitting beside at the banquet table? Who would I want to spend eternity with? And that, put it differently, would give you a different series of questions. See, so for me, I grew up, and maybe you grew up the same way, where holiness always meant they're set apart. It's, you immediately think of Mother Teresa, you immediately think of some saint, somebody who's and I don't doubt they're holy. So if you say to me, who's the holiest person you've ever met alive? Well, I thought of two people, a man and a woman. And the man I thought of is actually our superior general in Rome, Louis Logan. Louis is the most unassuming, human, gracious, open. Louis has no faults. But he doesn't look like Mother Teresa. He looks very human, and you'd always want to sit beside him at the table. And he never puts people down. He doesn't gossip. His sense of humor is very simple living man, and so on. Very bright, but doesn't know it. That's kind of, but he's a happy person. And then there's a woman I know in Edmonton, who are good family friends, who actually had a tragic background. When she was a young girl in England, she was raped and beaten, that she spent a year in the hospital recovering. And today she's probably the happiest person I know. She's married, kids, grandmother, but the same thing, there's just a warmth and a graciousness, a sense of humor, an openness, like lots of laughter, lots of warmth, deep spiritually, so I guess I posed myself, who would I want to be across the table from?
Yes.
For a long, long time, and no offense to Mother Teresa, I'd like to say hello to Mother Teresa and go to a different table. If you know what I mean.
To her and move right along. Yep.
Kind of, no doubt she's holy, but so that was a good question, because it got me thinking. I also thought of my dad. My dad was a wonderful man, and maybe the most moral man I ever met. But I wouldn't mind spending eternity with my dad. But my dad was more stoic. We used to tease him. We said his only excess is moderation. So
that's funny.
But so that's a good question, and because and keep asking people that, because I think immediately you think holy, you think of the Mother Teresa's and so on. I thought, I'm going to rephrase that for myself. Like, who do I want to sit beside for all eternity at a table? I want to say hello to Mother Teresa, but I want to go to a different table.
Yes.
Unless I don't know her well enough.
I love those, maybe not criteria, but at least qualities that you name of a holy person or a contemplative person, kind of like Carlo's mother, where it's like, who's the person who is being unselfish, but, naming out warmth, a sense of humor, just kind of a unassuming nature. Like, they're just very much themselves, and I remember...
And you're completely comfortable with. You're always completely comfortable with.
Yes. And I love that, because it makes holiness not something, again, set apart or out there, like, oh, to be this great contemplative means that you have to spend hours a day in silence and you're kind of somber, in your demeanor. Like, I think an over seriousness it can also be a sign of like, oh, maybe they take themselves a little too seriously, and that's something that, might be a fault. I don't know. Depends on the person, but recognizing that there is a very, I don't know, great sense of ease about people who are spiritually mature, rather than any kind of pretentiousness or, kind of set apartness that I can't quite reach.
Yeah.
So yeah, I like that.
That was a good question. That was a very good question.
How about deceased? Who would you say are one or two of the most important figures in your own spirituality?
Well, it's interesting. Well, you have the greats, so that, for instance, I've been deeply influenced by John of the Cross, been very deeply influenced by Therese of Lisieux. Those are my two favorite, classical mystics. And then going back earlier, St. Augustine. So probably the three great historical figures: Augustine, John of the Cross, Therese of Lisieux, somewhat by Julian of Norwich, although I haven't read her as closely, and so on. But just more closer to home. In fact, I just thought the other day, I want to write an article on this. Who are my contemporary saints? I want to name three of them. One of them is Henry Nouwen. Henry Nouwen, I knew Henry, but I knew his life. Henry was this complex man. Henry was a crisis looking to happen, but deeply sincere, always in a crisis, loving, and a mystic. But life was never easy for him. But somehow he showed, I could pull this off in all this complexity. So he has deeply influenced me, and there's rarely a day goes by I don't refer to him or quote him in some way, and so on. The second one is a man, and you're familiar with Daniel Berrigan. Daniel Berrigan, his thing to the poor, but beyond that, he was an incredible poet and writer. As a young man, I was envious of his talent, But also, Daniel Berrigan was the first person who could make a poetry out of celibacy and loneliness. Where I thought, there's something to be kind of a lonely prophet and so on. I thought he could put some. But I just admired his what he did and so on, his wisdom, his great sense of humor and so on. And the last one, I don't know if you have heard of her, she just died 2 years ago, very young, is Rachel Held Evans.
Oh, yes.
She was an evangelical writer who died at age 37. She's in my prayers every day. She's this young woman who she was kind of the Therese of Lisieux of our time, writing a different. So if you take, for instance, a couple of her books, In Search of Sundays, that could be today's story of, the story of a soul, see, in all three of them, there was a powerful humanity and a powerful faith that, there were three faith-filled people, none of whom had an easy life. Each of them kind of modeled sanctity for today, with Berrigan, I never met Berrigan, but maybe I was just blown away sometimes by his poetry and his idealism and so on. But I had a priest friend who himself got shot to death in Guatemala. One of our oblates, Larry Roseball, but he went to prison a couple of times to the Berrigans, and he'd tell me a lot of stories about Daniel. He said before they would do an act, they would pray the whole night. So that in the morning, they would get up and they'd say mass. And they'd put in their mass vestments. And they'd walk across this act to burn draft files. And Daniel always said, Larry, if you can't do this without getting angry and bitter at the people arrest you, don't do it. He said, don't need another angry man. There was also a deep kind of a sanctity to him and so on. And his nonviolence and so on. I've also been influenced by Dorothy Day. I'm doing more and more reading on Dorothy Day, but I didn't have as much natural affinity to Dorothy Day as I do to Berrigan, Nouwen. And Nouwen I met a couple of times, but we have so many mutual friends that I just know all of Henry's struggles, which are massive. but he was a saint in progress, but he always stayed with it. And so he was this complex, in some ways tortured man who wrote these incredible books, but died in fidelity.
Yes. I love the contemporary examples because we do get more of that complexity. I think a lot of the ones who are, from hundreds of years ago, we have them only through filters and, writings and kind of get the hagiography of like, oh, they just like had the perfume of sanctity since they were an infant, and you're like, oh, okay, well, that's not me. But to find the people who are more complex, I mean, I love that about Therese as well. I mean, that she was my confirmation saint. I read her Story of a Soul when I was 14. And I remember being so offended in my religious community the first time I heard somebody say, like, she was kind of psychotic, right? I was like, I felt so offended, but then eventually I came around to like, actually, that gives me hope. If Therese struggled with psychoses, then there's hope for all of us, because we've all got our psychoses and kind of whatever.
Well, one of the things I really liked about Therese, because it took me a while to like her, because if you read her superficially, she can come across, and plus piety has kind of encrusted her with so much piety. Mm-hmm. But when you read her, there's an incredible complexity to this person. For instance, she's always the pious little girl, and she's also Sophia. And there is a little girl in her begging for affection. There's also like she's always the opposite of all of that. And the same with Henry Nouwen. They're really complex. And so that their life wasn't simple. Like Therese, it wasn't so simple as they made it sound, and so on. Mm-hmm. But now she's my mystic. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you a quick story on her, just not on her, but the Story of a Soul. And I try to reread it maybe every 2 or 3 years. There aren't a lot of books I reread, but some years ago, I had a psychologist friend who was really a crack psychologist on the West Coast. And he was dying. We were the same age. He was dying at age 53. And he was dying of cancer, And people bring him books to read, and he couldn't read. At one point, he said, the only thing I can still read while I'm dying is Therese of Lisieux. He said, she cuts away all the crap. He said, when you're dying, there's a lot of literature makes sense to you. Said there was the one book he kept. And he wasn't a particular religious man. It's just, I was really struck by it. I said, that's the one book I can still read.
Yes.
It grounds me.
Yeah, I love that. And there is such great simplicity in her. In our Women Mystic School, which both of us will be speaking at. I'll be doing Therese on her feast day on October 1st. And then we have...
make sure you send me a link, because I want to listen to that.
Yes, absolutely. I will do that. And we have you speaking about Ruth Burrows coming up here in September. And I'm curious, for those who have never heard of Ruth, what would be, a couple sentences that you would say, like, why she is an important mystic amongst all of these greats? Why should people know about Ruth?
A couple of things. First of all, she's a Carmelite. Mm-hmm. And it is the contemporary Carmelite author. Ruth just turned 99. Okay.
Yeah. That's one incredible thing, that she's still alive.
Yeah. But she's a true mystic. Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll just give you, again, because we've been talking about this all afternoon here. I first got interested in her. I was in a bookstore, didn't know who she was, picked up her autobiography. And these were the first lines. I thought, I'm going to read this. She says, I was born into this life with a tortured sensitivity, and my life has been a struggle. I thought, notice that I wasn't serene. I says, I was born. And so she tells her story, and she became this great mystic. But no, she says, I was born into this life with a tortured sensitivity. I twice went to see her in England. One time did a retreat on her, and she's just this incredibly deep but marvelous woman. Some of your viewers may know Wendy Beckett, the art critic, sister. See, she lived with Ruth Burrows' monastery, and is one of the and she was a mystic too. She was one of the people that they did mystical writings together and collaborated on, and so on. And Orbis Press is just coming out with a a huge book of letters of Sister Wendy and Wendy
Lovely.
Beckett, the art critic. But Ruth is, she's a contemporary mystic. She's still alive. And there's a clarity in her. She can actually be difficult to read sometimes. She's not an easy, she's a straight shooter. You know, you mentioned that people said they found Teresa of Lisieux psychotic. This is Ruth's thing on Teresa of Avila. Said Teresa of Avila was one of the most neurotic women who ever lived. She said she was the same. But among other things that may interest you, she did a photographic study of Teresa of Lisieux. Because remember, we have hundreds of pictures of Teresa of Lisieux, you know. And Ruth did a photographic study of that. And she came up with this, says, you know, when you look at Teresa of Lisieux and all the photographs, individual or with a group, says she's always deeply alone. There's an aloneness to her that even when she's in a photograph, and when she was in community, she was one of the most communitarian of all the nuns. But you look at her photographs, she's always deeply, deeply alone. So she's a contemporary Carmelite. And look at the Carmelite tradition, but she also writes her own mysticism.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to learning more about her, because I know I've heard people talking about Ruth Burrows, like in some of the circles of like Center for Action and Contemplation, and other people are slowly discovering her works. And so I'm excited to be able to share her with a wider audience. I think that'll be quite wonderful.
I hope she's still alive in September. So
I do too. We are almost on time here, but before we wrap up today, Ron, if people want to learn more about you and your books and what you're up to, where should they go?
Well, I have a website. If you just go to Google and type in ronrolheiser.com, and more stuff's going to come up than you want to know about, and so on. But, you know, I've been writing a newspaper column for more than 40 years. And it's exactly 40 years this year.
Wow.
And you know, there's an archives on there, different articles, books, and as well, you know, and you've met Joanne. There's a full-time person that's running all of this, and she does Facebook and where I am at and so on. So
wonderful. Keeps tabs on you.
Yeah.
That's excellent. And if anyone listening wants to join us for Women Mystics, whether for Ruth Burrows or Therese or any of the classes that we're having a once a month class on a different female mystic, and you can find out more about that at womenmystics.org. I think I'm very excited for the upcoming classes, so I can't wait to hear and learn more about Ruth. So Ron, thank you so much for joining us today and entertaining all of our questions and wanderings into mysticism and divine union. It's been a delight.
Well, I'm going to have to ask you sometime who is you, the holiest person you've ever met, and why. You know.
Yes. I'm going to have to think about that. I need to think about the questions that I pose to other people so that I'm prepared to answer them in return. But I would probably respond with qualities that are quite similar, like people who are very grounded and down to earth. And I can think of a few people, a good friend who's a mother, a friend who is in the religious community I was with over in Rome, who are just very simple, grounded, have a great sense of humor, and are very good at being present. I think that's...
Thanks, Kelly.